Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Southern Branch. Just a bit of housekeeping, please keep your microphones on silent, on mute. If you do have any questions, if you could pop them in the chat, that would be most helpful because it's difficult to find any hands up in the list of people. We will do some questions at the end of the presentation. Would like to take the opportunity to remind you that all the views in the presentation are that of the presenter and not of the IFE. Today's presentation will be recorded and should be available on the Southern Branch website for viewing at any later dates. Okay, I'll pass over to Elspeth today, and we're going to talk about the EEIS proposals and if they meet the Grenfell Tower Phase 1 recommendations.
Put my microphone on. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invite to be with you today. My name's Elspeth Grant. For those of you who haven't heard of me, I've been working with organisations in the public sector and the commercial sector, delivering strategies for getting disabled people out of buildings, preferably in a cost-effective manner. Also described by Brian Martin, the civil servant at the inquiry, as an argumentative member of the public, a badge I wear with pride, I'm afraid. Might have a t-shirt done. I come from a corporate background, having spent 16 years delivering systems integration programs for BT Syntegra, both in North America and the UK. So I can assure you that budgets, cost effectiveness are drilled into my DNA. Okay, so where are we? Emergency evacuation information sharing consultation, which of course has just been launched by the Home Office. And at the moment, my slides won't go down. There we go. I think nobody can forget, given the events of yesterday, the 5th anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, June 2017, will be something that any of us in the industry will remember. It's also worth remembering that 15 of the 37 disabled residents died, 25% of all the children. These were the children that had been running about corridors in a safe environment, visiting their friends. So almost half of the fatalities were disabled people or children, so i.e. the vulnerable. The worst disaster anyway since the Second World War. And here we are 5 years later, we're still discussing whether disabled people can be evacuated from buildings. So we have had the Grenfell Tower Phase 1 inquiry.
Sorry, Elspeth.
Sorry?
Can I just jump in? I don't know if you're showing slides at the moment, but I'm just looking at a picture of yourself. So I don't think that's showing.
That is interesting. Right, sorry about that. That's no good. Yes, I am showing, and you should be seeing them. Right. Is that better?
Yeah, got you. Thank you.
Apologies, everyone. Okay, I'll just go back to the previous slide. Right. I will not labour the point because I think we're all very aware of it. So we've had the Grenfell Tower Phase 1 inquiry. Recommendations, 2 specific recommendations about evacuation of disabled people. So every owner and manager of every high-rise. Now, of course, what Sir Martin Morbit did not specify is what a high-rise is. The government has chosen to define that as over 18 metres. But of course, for a disabled person who's living on the 6th floor of a building just under 18 metres is as at risk as a person, or more at risk than a disabled person living on the 3rd floor of a higher building. The other recommendation was 3322F about providing information in PIB boxes. Now, we're going to be focusing on that first recommendation and whether this new EEIS consultation actually fulfills that recommendation. So we've already had 2 full previous consultations from the Home Office. We had the one published in July 2020. Interestingly enough, although they published the responses for all the other elements, that was the general fire safety consultation, the Home Office chose not to publish a table of the percentage responses to 2.7 on personal emergency plans. So I submitted an FOI request to the Home Office, and that showed that in fact 30.5% strongly agreed with the implementation of PEEPs and 36.5% tended to agree. I'm not going to make any comment as to why that was never published. So then we had another consultation last year, which was accompanied by 4 workshops, all of which I was invited to attend. And the results of that have only just been published, at which 83% of the respondents agreed and 60% of the respondents strongly agreed. Now, it's interesting to note that the majority of responses were from responsible people, social housing organisations, councils. Only 6% were from disabled people. So this was not a result that was weighted by specific groups. So what have we got? We now have emergency evacuation information sharing. Step 1, defining the building evacuation strategy. Not really got a problem with that. As long as you don't describe stay put as an evacuation strategy. I really cannot get my head around that. Identification of those needing support to evacuate. No real problem with that. Person-centered fire risk assessment checklist. Again, no particular problem with that, because that is all about reducing risk. And I always say there is no such thing as zero risk in life. We all get in our cars every day. We know we put on our safety belts, we have airbags, but in fact, we may have a crash and we may be injured, but we accept that as an acceptable risk. I've no problem with step 4, sharing the information with local fire and rescue services. No particular problem with step 5, so that they can access and use this information. The problem is none of that involves producing a PEEP. And when you consider that the objective of PEEP is that any resident, a disabled resident, can actually move away from the vicinity of the fire. The total evacuation of a building is a separate issue to me. The most important thing is there is a fire in their flat or in the same corridor, that they have ability to move away. And of course, the EEIS will only apply to those buildings with a simultaneous evacuation strategy. That was not what the recommendation stated. It said every high rise. So we're already reducing the scope. And there you have it. Now, given the results from the previous 2 consultations, it's really difficult to understand the direction of travel by the Home Office. Clearly, the majority of the people who responded, the majority agreed with the proposals. So why that's now we're going back into yet another consultation, I really don't understand. So who said what? It's quite interesting about the statements that have been made and the organisations that haven't made statements about the consultation. The most important to me is the Fire Brigades Union. The government's decision is a negative backward step, and the FBU stands with disability campaigners, the Grenfell campaign groups, and the LGA. Now, I'm probably a bit old-fashioned, but I think if you're trying to implement a policy, it's probably a good idea to get on board the representative union for the members who are going to have to deliver that policy. The local government authority. Remember, this was the organisation that published the fire safety and purpose-built flats, that actually said it was unrealistic and unreasonable to evacuate disabled people. However, here they are questioning the legality of the proposals, and also are aware that the fire service also has serious reservations. And then there's the Chartered Institute of Housing. its failure to require the implementation of PEEPs, inadequate proposals. The government has not taken the steps required to protect disabled residents of high-rise. Now, I'm not even going into the realms of what disabled groups think about this, but I'm sure you will have seen their thoughts in the press. These are all organisations that I've asked major stakeholders in the industry. So, April the 4th, Lord, and I'm sorry, there is a typo, Lord Greenhalgh. I will correct that. A Minister of State of the UK government stated on record to the world in the House of Lords. He spoke about practicality, he spoke about proportionality, and then he spoke about safety. So let's have a look at these in a little more detail. On practicality, how can you evacuate a mobility impaired person from a tall building before the professionals from the fire and rescue service arrive? Well, it would appear that the good citizens of London who live in general needs have managed to work something out that Lord Greenhalgh has no idea how it can be achieved. This table is taken off the publicly available LFB incident database, and those in reds are where significant people have evacuated prior to the arrival of the FRS. And you can see Purley, Stratford, Dagenham, all in January. 100 people had left the building. Now, these figures I would suggest are obviously rounded up. I assume that the incident commanders are pretty good at gauging how many people are out on the street. Vauxhall in October, 120, and so it goes on. All before the fire and rescue services. So how are they managing it? Well, I'm going to hold up, if you can see it, mobile phone. Do we need fire alarms in common areas? Because of course people have WhatsApp groups, texting, and I always ask how many of us would actually tell somebody we loved or an 18-year-old going off to student halls, multi-storey building, when the fire alarm goes off, don't worry, stay put. People just aren't staying put. And can you blame them? So, an interesting fact on practicality. The consultation document states that the Home Office couldn't find any evidence that PEEPs were in place or being pursued without the use of on-site staff. Now, this is a statement in a government document publicly available. It also says, instead, most local initiatives, as described, are focused on raising awareness of fire safety, wider improvements or remediation, and the provision of in-flat measures. Really? Is that evidence-based? These policies and procedures are supposed to be based on evidence. So let's look at the evidence. Just a high-level look. Well, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea responded to the PEEPs consultation, and in that response, and I've given you the link there, fire safety leaflets to all residents, irrespective of height, automatic extinguishers systems within the flat. Fair dues. Every resident who requires a PEEP offered one. Annual letters sent to the 5,734 general needs homes. Residents encouraged to self-identify. And they have actually done 148 tailored PEEPs and 238 PCFRAs. And the other interesting thing, although the response is a little unclear, but assuming that they haven't put on-site members into those employees into those 148 tailored PEEPs, they are using family members, care staff and willing neighbours to act as buddies. So I take my hat off to Keith Todd, Head of Fire Safety by RBKC in 2019. Credit where credit's due. So, result of inside housing, FOI requests. 22 councils have implemented PEEPs and general needs, including, I'm not going to read them all out. And in fact, some of these, you only have to do a Google search. Maybe the Home Office hasn't actually discovered Google yet, but if you Google Council Housing Association, you will come up with multiple websites where councils and authorities are saying, contact us, we will provide you with a PEEP. And of course, there are housing associations who are doing exactly the same. Interestingly enough, it is also becoming increasingly common for this being raised on Fire and Rescue Service websites as well for general needs. So let's move on to proportionality. How much is it reasonable to spend to do this at the same time as we seek to protect residents and taxpayers from excessive costs? Now, we all recognise the government is probably pretty stung from the cladding crisis, the problems of the leaseholders who have had terrible, terrible problems. But let's just look at costs. So, operational costs for the fire and rescue services. Remember, since 2005 with the fire safety order, the fire and rescue services have been completely ring-fenced from any liability for evacuation. Now, I have my own personal views as to why that was. I think it was a clever piece of legislation from a public sector point of view, but they have been ring-fenced. Now, there is absolutely no doubt, and I have taken quite high-level legal advice or legal views, and of course, they'll never make a real statement categorically, but certainly the view of the legal legals that I've spoken to are that this transfers liability for the safe evacuation of disabled people back onto the fire and rescue services, because this is no longer a rescue. And of course, they have advanced knowledge. So they're going to know in advance, because that information is going to be in a premises information box. Now, that has a huge effect on fire and rescue services for their operational planning, and is probably one of the reasons why the FBU is so against this. If we actually look at the guidance that's there, the FIA and FCC, Code of Practice, provision of premises information boxes. And if you go down to, off the top of my head, I think it's section 1.8, they actually say how many firefighters should be operationally planned for a rescue or evacuation. I'm not going to read them all out, but if you take a mean average of 2 per disabled people, that means that London Fire Brigade would have to plan for 74 firefighters just to evacuate the 37 disabled people at Grenfell. That's not fighting a fire, that's safely evacuating following this guidance. Now, I would suggest that that is enormous. So I very much hope on proportionality that the government has very, very deep pockets. And that's before you start on training costs for different types of assisted escape devices and impairments, and we'll come back to that later. So then, of course, we have costs. We have the Equality Act. The EHRC, Equality and Human Rights Commission, have already advised residents that assisted escape devices are a reasonable adjustment. And also that there is, of course, the anticipatory duty for public sector. So if you're a council or you're a public authority, or rescue services, there is an anticipatory duty under the Equality Act. You don't have to wait until there's a fire and then go, oh, what are we going to do? You have to anticipate their needs. Liabilities, again, that may fall back onto the fire and rescue services or onto building owners and responsible people. Fines and compensation claims. Now, I put a link in down the bottom there in 10, how to work out the value of a discrimination claim. Now, claims are done on something called a Vento scale. So you have a low band, middle band, and higher band. So a lower band is, for instance, somebody is refused to take their guide dog into a restaurant. It's a one-off, happens. Higher band is awarded where there is continued discrimination that causes stress, ongoing stress, and mental health issues. Now, I would suggest that being in a building that you cannot ever escape from, just imagine if non-disabled people, if we said to the general public, okay, here's your building, We consider it's pretty safe. We've done a level 4 risk assessment. So one of the safest buildings. So when there's a fire, actually all your fire doors are going to lock shut. Because we don't want you wandering about the stairwells because you might cause a problem for firefighters. But don't worry, when the firefighters arrive and enter the building, we'll unlock the fire doors and then make a decision. That would never fly. We know it wouldn't fly. None of us would agree with that. But that is the situation, make no doubt about it, that many, many disabled residents are living in 24/7. So what other costs are we going to have to consider? Well, again, the legal beagles say, well, we'll end up with a conflict in law. So we're going to certainly have to amend primary legislation. Article 14, at the moment, it states that it must be possible for all relevant persons to evacuate. Have to make it non-disabled persons and specify this article does not apply to disabled people. Then there's Article 15, which I, as I've already said, already consider is the most important, that being able to move away from imminent danger. And again, we're going to have to caveat that, aren't we? Apart from disabled people. And then we come back to this nominate a sufficient number of competent persons. And can I just raise here, that doesn't say of competent employees, and I'll come back to that, to implement those procedures as far as they relate to the evacuation of non-disabled persons. And that's the reality of what we'll have to put, the government will have to put in place for this legislation, regulations and proposals to fly. Otherwise, responsible persons will continue to face a criminal record, imprisonment or fines. So, moving on with costs and proportionality on this proposal. Of course, there's a lot of guidance that will all have to be amended to exclude disabled people. We're talking about building regs, approved documents. We're talking about definitely the Home Office guides, although that's probably not too much of a problem because they're being rewritten anyway. There's LACORS, Housing Fire Safety. Then there's all the BSI standards and codes of practice, where equality is embedded in each of them. We have the NFCC Enforcers Guide and the draft one that hasn't been published yet. That will need to be re-amended. We have means of escape for disabled people and sleeping accommodation. Now, all of this has a cost, whether you're government or whether you're, whether you're British standards, all has a cost and a lead time. And here we come to the one that I find the most difficult and the most, I still cannot believe that a Minister of State of the UK government actually stated this on record in public to the world. And I'm going to read this out. On safety, how can you ensure that an evacuation of mobility impaired people is carried out in a way that does not hinder others in evacuating or the fire service in fighting the fire? Just let that sink in what that says to 1 in 5 of the population, 14.6 million, and may I say voters of this country. We're actually saying to them, well, actually, we're not going to worry about getting you out in a fire because you might stop the important people getting out. Is that really who we are as I don't believe that that is who we are as an industry. I refuse to believe that. I believe that the majority of us do put women and children vulnerable in an emergency first. So why is it important? Let's talk about safety. Probably most of you will be aware of the University of Leeds and Phil Murphy research. Now, this was research into data from the Home Office, provided by the Home Office on the IRS data, which was filled in by the Fire and Rescue Services, going back to 2010 and coming forward to 2019-20. So this is evidence-based. Now, you can quibble over whether, one category was right. They had to take a view on making sure that the research made sense. And what that actually showed us was, yes, response periods, an average of 7.5 minutes. Very fast, because that's average. But in fact, it was 25 minutes before there was primary intervention period at high level. So if you're on the 19th floor, a disabled person unable to move from immediate danger, on average, and this is just on average, you could be waiting half an hour. Half an hour. If your flat is on fire, waiting in the corridor, or somebody who's left their flat open because their flat door's open because there's a fire in their flat, and you're sat there with toxic gases, unable to move vertically or maybe horizontally. Again, what else did that data show us? But just before we go on to that, I'll just mention New Providence Wharf on safety. And I've again provided the link there, and it is a press report, but I have seen the interviews, the actual live interviews. Residents are making their own arrangements. Residents are buying rope ladders. Disabled families are buying their own assisted escape devices. Now that's when I think this starts to become a safety issue. If residents are seriously going to throw themselves off balconies and start descending on a rope ladder because they don't trust us as an industry to put in sensible evacuation. And the same applies to families. They know how many disabled people died at Grenfell. They also know how vulnerable they are. If they go out and choose an evacuation chair that maybe doesn't have a dead man's handle or isn't friction based, this may cause problems. So we owe it to them on safety grounds to get this right. And this is the other graph that I think is most important, to show that if you're in the vicinity of a fire for more than 20 minutes, this again is evidence provided on the IRS database, that deaths as a percentage of all FCRs against rescues, and you can see that your chance of rescue falls dramatically. So if we're going to leave disabled people in buildings until a firefighter is able to intervene, I would suggest that isn't safe. So let's have a little flick down disability facts and figures. At the bottom there, 9,793 tower blocks, unsafe in England. 500,000 people living in medium rise, unsafe buildings. 700,000 living in unsafe buildings over 18. And then when we look at the disabled community, that's 18% of the UK population. Are we seriously saying that we actually cannot put evacuation planning in for 18% of the population? Now, I believe strongly in the fire industry in the UK. I think we have amazing engineers. We have amazing fire professionals. I refuse again to believe that it is beyond their wit to be able to implement this. The other thing that's particularly interesting is the 83% of people become disabled during their lifetime. And that means that you or I, tomorrow, somebody we love, our partner, ourselves, all of a sudden this could become very, very real. And certainly when I've been delivering training over the last 10 years, I always get delegates to actually write on their name pad on the table the person they love most in the world. And I always say, it's that person that we're actually talking about. What would you tell that person? What would you want to put in place for that person? And I think that's very, very important. So at the top there, the EEIS, let us be in no doubt, places the liability for the safe evacuation of disabled people squarely onto the fire and rescue services. And here's some figures. Now, not all of them will live in high-rise. Not all of them will live in social renters, but a high proportion will be. Not all of them will need a PEEP. But if I just pick out a few that might give a challenge for firefighters, osteoporosis, 3 million people. Now, osteoporosis along with diabetes, causes the density of bones to degenerate. That means that if you scoop somebody up as your friendly firefighter and decide to rescue them or run down the stairs, then you're highly likely to break their ribs, which can in turn pierce vital organs. Therefore, you may not be rescuing a live person by the time you get down to the bottom. If we look at somebody living with cancer, now if they've just had chemo, they might not even be able to leave their bed. Stroke survivors, morbidly obese. Now, morbidly obese is usually the category or the impairment that people immediately say when they say, well, you can't do PEEPs. You know, I know the case of morbidly obese. That doesn't mean you can't do anything. You can certainly defend in depth, and you need to put equipment in, some type of equipment that might help a firefighter, even if they cannot self-evacuate. Autistic. I was very surprised at the UCLAN test. I was at the Tall Buildings Conference last month, and I was very surprised that they only seemed to be interested in mobility impaired during that test evacuation. But of course, somebody with autism is just as likely to fight a firefighter because of their impairment, noise, the fire alarms, or alternatively, they're also likely to be hiding. So if a firefighter knows that there is an autistic residence, it's not good enough just to open the door, oh, the apartment's empty. They need to actually check it's properly empty. Spinal injuries, I think, speak for themselves. You know, starting the day as a paraplegic, you go to work, you're the main breadwinner, you come back in the evening, you're unlucky enough to have to be evacuated, and by the morning you're quadriplegic. Supposed to be grateful? It's not a success story, and I do not believe that any firefighters or fire industry professional would want that to happen. Training. We've been delivering training since 2011, IFE accredited, IFSM accredited, has always until the last year been instructor-led, but partly thanks to COVID, you have to look on the bright side of this. We've moved everything across to e-learning. Now, we believe that it's not just about doing a training course. We believe that training, education is ongoing. I learn something every day when I either talk to people or I train people or I'm resolving issues. We all learn. So very much we see that the platform is about giving people the tools that they need to go through. And therefore, the way we provide the training platform is as a 12-month subscription, regular updates, giving reference and library, and we also give templates. And let me give you just one example of one person. I'll let her talk.
My personal assistant opens up my evacuation chair. We transfer from my wheelchair using my existing hoist. My wheelchair stays in the flap out of the way. When we descend the stairs, my neighbours can still pass and we can stop on the way if we need to.
Now, I will rerun it. Let me just say a couple of things at this point. You will notice here, dead man's handle. If the operator takes her hands off that evacuation chair will go nowhere. It will not endanger other residents. It will stay because it has friction based. It will just stay still. And incidentally, the width of the stairwell just about made it into part M. So this is not a wide stairwell.
The fire alarm sounds. My personal assistant.
So you notice here, very easy. Doesn't take much training. It also protects
from my wheelchair
the person, the disabled person. Now this person has brittle bones.
The flap out of the way.
We make sure that the wheelchair doesn't
can still pass and we can
harm the way for other people. All important things.
The fire alarm.
So the dreaded PEEP. Now we all hate, well I do anyway, documentation. When we were first running fire risk assessment contracts, I found that many fire risk assessors had no problem going out to site, but actually getting the documentation. We're all the same, starting with a blank piece of paper. So what we have developed, and we provide these as templates on the training platform, we provide, let me just get that up. Now, these are not tick box exercises, but they are a very quick way of documenting the information. Now, in our view, a PEEP is about the disabled person, but I am passionate about ensuring that the responsible person can prove their due diligence. And for me, that is as important as anything else, that should there be a disaster, should there be a fatality, that the responsible person can pick up a wad of paper and say, we still had a fatality. It didn't in the end have a good result, but this is what I did. I did everything I could reasonably be expected to do. So in the case of most buildings, we know that there are going to be multiple disabled residents. It would be very unusual for there not to be. And remember, many of these disabled people have lived there all their lives. Some of them moved in 30 years ago. Their social network, their lives are there. So it isn't just as simple as, well, let's move them to a little bungalow in suburbia, even if we had the housing stock to do so. So the first thing is to look at the building, decide what the building type is. Is it over 18 metres? You can see here that we document the legislation. Now, don't forget, many people are very fixated on using employees. But if you use an employee, you have duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. You cannot put an employee in danger. So if you're going to think about using a waking watch, either to evacuate disabled people or to run around a burning building, just remember you have a liability towards them. Then we say, what is the evacuation strategy? Is it immediate? Where can people evacuate to? Is the waking watch? Compliance of the building. And then we document the evacuation plan, PEEP policy and procedures. A quick mention for test drills. I always find it very interesting because, of course, there is legal requirement for test drills, safety drills, but of course they are never, or as far as I'm aware, rarely done in general needs. Why not? Certainly when we do PEEPs for a disabled person, we suggest that they practice it at least once a month. Get the evac chair out, maybe when, or the assisted escape device or whatever other device, practice. That's what we do in offices, where our risk of death is very, very low. We chuck out regularly. Post-evacuation, where are people going to go? Well, most high-rise particularly are in centres of towns and cities. Go and talk to the local hotel, somewhere to have as a holding in the worst case scenario. Action plan for both disabled and non-disabled people. And then actually document the, I'm just going to try and find my way back to where I was, which may be more difficult than I'm expecting. So what about the actual PEEP? I'm disabled, not stupid. I put that up because disabled people and their families spend their lives filling in forms. They spend their lives having to fight for benefits for every step of the way. They are very capable of filling in a form. They already know much of the answer. So we have structured the templates to ensure that the person is very easy. So you can give this to a disabled person, or you can give it to their family or their care team to fill it in. They're not difficult to fill in. So what are we wanting to know? Are they at high risk? Is it an employee? Do they wish to be relocated? all the basic things. We also document whether oxygen cylinders are present. Now, all right, there already is a protocol where fire and rescue services should be aware. And remember the numbers of people with respiratory illness in the UK, many, many million. But it's a double chance of making sure everyone knows. So then we look at the evacuation. What's the scale? Can the fire alarm? We're looking at all the different elements of an evacuation. Oh, buddies. And here we come back to, can a buddy be a family, neighbour or friends? Well, in the USA they can, Canada they can. We're actually quite an outlier in not accepting. And can I just say one other thing? I'm not going to ask for hands up, but if you were in that situation, would you abandon somebody in your family to run? Would you abandon even a close friend? And I suspect that most people, and we found this in Grenfell Tower, we know at Grenfell Tower that the fatalities and injuries went up because people wouldn't abandon people who were unable to evacuate. So using buddies, there's no legal precluder to being able to use family, neighbours and friends. So what we're looking at is trying to cover as much of the day. And yes, you will always find the loner, the person where it becomes very difficult. But that doesn't mean that this shouldn't work for everyone else. We're also looking at what auxiliary aids would be needed, a manual assisted escape device, a manual hoist maybe. Remember, if the electricity fails, it might be difficult. But also remember that families all the time are actually moving their people, their family members. They do it every day. You don't need a firefighter to do that. Families can do it. And right down here, we actually look at how long will it take them to get away from immediate danger, to give us an idea. Now, we would always try and get somebody out of the building within 27 minutes, in that magic half an hour. The actual plan given to the person, make it simple, something they can stick on the back of their door or on their kitchen cupboard. We document test evacuations. How often is it reviewed? We make sure the person either confirms it in writing or by email. And then we put the plan and either provide it to the fire and rescue services or in the PIB. So that's our approach. There's lots of them. There's lots of different templates. We've been using this for a long time. Fillable forms, word fillable forms, an excellent way to go. And in finishing, just food for thought. Can you imagine a fire on a cruise ship in the English Channel? And all the fit and able, all the non-disabled people get in the lifeboats. And they say to the disabled people and the elderly and the children, oh, you're much safer here than bobbing about the English Channel in a little boat. I mean, we talk about migrants. You stay here on the boat. The air sea rescue will be along, I'm sure, in good time. Can you imagine the headlines? And yet that is the situation on land that we seem to feel is perfectly acceptable. So key takeaways, and leaves quarter of an hour for questions and answers if anybody has any. Excuse me. I would suggest that EEIS proposals do not meet the requirements. I cannot understand where the Home Office has gone with this. It's very clear that many councils and housing associations are currently implementing PEEPs. These proposals will require amendment of the law and guidance to exclude disabled people, will require amendment to the Equality Act to remove the anticipatory duty where it applies to fire safety, and will require amendment of every single bit of guidance that actually currently states that evacuation of disabled people must be without the help of the fire and rescue services. So I'll be interested in your thoughts. I always believe it's good to debate and share and explore. And happy to open it up now to any questions and answers, and back to Dean and Dana.
Thank you, Elspeth. I think that was a really thought-provoking webinar. We just had a conversation. I work for Peabody Housing Association, and we just spoke this week about stop looking at things as assets. They're people's homes, they're people, and it really relates to, like you said, think of someone that you love the most and imagine that's the person that can't escape the flat. And, you know, when you change it and look at it like that, it's completely different.
It's certainly very easy to get into the semantics and professional discussions. And I mean, I watched the BBC Newsnight. They did a follow-up on the 21st Floor documentary they'd done, and followed up what had happened to the people. And just to remember that you know, it could be any of us.
Definitely. And am I right that the proposal, the consultation is still open, so people can go and give it?
Yeah, I've put the link on one of the slides. It's opened until the 10th of August, and there is an online response. I haven't looked at it in detail because one of the things I hadn't mentioned is that these proposals are the subject of a judicial pre-action judicial review letter. So I will be honest, if I hadn't been doing the webinar today, I probably wouldn't have spent a great deal of time on it, because until that is responded to, I have heard people who have looked at the response letters, the response questions, that as with the PEEPS consultation, for those of us that responded to the PEEPS consultation, that a lot of the questions are ambiguous in that it's very difficult. They're mixed in the same question as to whether you say strongly agree or not, but time will tell.
Brilliant. And there was one question from Dean about if you know of any self-using evacuation chairs, if someone doesn't have a buddy or family member to help. I
do, actually. There is a wonderful one that, and particularly good, I mean, you do have to have, and as many wheelchair users do have, strong upper body things, very good for students. And I will, in fact, I had been going to put, but decided I'd probably run out of time, which is a shame because I think I would have had time. I will send over a link to you of a very manual wheelchair, completely usable on your own, goes up really steep stairs, turns on a whistle. It's a really good piece of kit.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think technology now is coming so far that, you know, there are the, you know, portable systems that you can use. And I think for me as well, education is a massive one. Like you said, I know there's been cases of, I know it was just in a house where a child with autism, the mum jumped the window and assumed the child would follow, but he didn't understand the danger. So, you know, educating people on what that, and I think children now as well, they don't quite understand and know, we don't teach them how to put out a fire.
It's one of the things we cover in one of the modules on the training course, is that somebody with autism may well go towards danger rather than away, and also may re-enter a building before it's safe. So these are all quite subtle things which can save lives.
Definitely. I haven't got any more questions in the chat, so if anyone does have any, please do let us now know. Otherwise, we'll be ready to wrap up and enjoy the sunshine.
Well, thank you very much. And if I put my email address on the slides, and if anybody wants to contact me, please do feel free.